Today our case brings us to Northern Ireland and to a case I was deeply moved by. This case points out how being somewhat part of something doesn't mean a whole lot when it comes down to it. It doesn't take a lot for your counterparts to turn on you. While our modern day ethos is women empowering women and lifting each other up, I notice the opposite is true. Nothing much has changed. If anything, it has gotten worse. We now have a tool to tear each other down, the internet. And depending on our feelings or our dislike for someone, we have no problem using it. But I ask you, would you say what you say to a person online face to face, or is it just behind the keyboards? Back in 1974, they didn't have this luxury. It was dealt with head on, whether it be warranted or not. In this case, it wasn't. Not that murder is ever warranted, but it shows that women that are deemed the fairer sex is not always the case. They can be worse than men. Women can be devious, manipulative, jealous, and they are just as capable of violence and murder. It is not a shock anymore to hear of a woman taking a life, even though men are still the main protagonists, but the scale is surely tipping. Normally, I am not a fan of Wikipedia for information, but this case was so well written and summarised that I have used it as my main source of information on the case, having backed up the information with other sources. So shout out to Jean Maria Griffin, thank you. Also, I will have to go into a lot of explanation for those of you not from Northern Ireland as to who is who and what certain elements of the case mean, so I ask you to bear with me. It is a minefield of information, but so interesting. This killing had nothing to do with politics or directly with the Troubles, but did indirectly involve factions of the Troubles as it is known as, which most people are familiar with this terminology. This was not a one-off incident of a woman losing her life in this way during the Troubles, and maybe in the future I will delve into more women that were killed at the hands of women and men during this time, or were instrumental in their killing on both sides, as the IRA had women also on the front line. The UDA, which is the Ulster Defence Association, was the largest loyalist paramilitary organisation in Northern Ireland and was launched in 1971. It has matched and even surpassed the violence of the IRA in the 1990s. The IRA stands for the Irish Republican Army. To simply put it, the UDA was a legal entity, although it did take part in illegal activities, was loyal to the Queen, and the IRA were nationalists who wanted a united Ireland. This case involves the UDA and what they did to their own, as in President. This woman had no affiliation to the group and was considered an outsider. The men, the leaders of the UDA, condoned what happened and took no responsibility for the killing by these women. Sandy Row is a historically working-class loyalist area in South Belfast, beginning at the edge of the city centre close to the Europa Hotel. The road runs south from the Boyne Bridge over the old Dublin railway line beside Grand Central Station, then across Donegal Road and ends at the bottom of Lisburn Road. Known for its strong Protestant traditions, Orangism, and the 12th of July festivities, which marked the victory of King William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne, with murals and flags reflecting its history. It is a staunchly loyalist area and heartland of the paramilitary Ulster Defence Association and Orange Order. The Battle of the Boyne took place in 1690 between the forces of the deposed King James II and of King William III, Prince of Orange, who with his wife Queen Mary II, who was his cousin and James's daughter, had ascended to the crowns of England and Scotland in 1689. The battle was fought across the River Boyne, close to the town of Drogheda in the Kingdom of Ireland, and resulted in a victory for William. This turned the tide in James's failed attempt to regain the British crown, and ultimately aided in ensuring the continued Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. So with this mini history lesson over with, I will get on with the case. Anne Ogilby was a daughter to parents who came from a very poor Protestant background. They were a family of 13 siblings and were originally from Sines Mills in County Tyrone. Anne was described as a very attractive woman with dark brown silky hair, blue eyes and a slender figure. Anne moved to Sandy Row in South Belfast at the age of 17. She was known to lead a transient lifestyle, always moving house and changing jobs. The jobs she had were mostly low paid, whether it be in a shop as an assistant or in an office. Unfortunately, because of this, she often failed to pay her rent, and so was frequently evicted. Her good looks made her very popular amongst the men, and in 1974 she gave birth to a baby boy. This was not her first child, but her last. In all, she would have 4 children, her eldest Charlene, who she would keep, and twin boys Stephen and Gary, who she put up for adoption straight after their birth, and then her youngest Derek, who was born premature just 2 months before Anne's death. Anne was 26 years of age in 1968. She would meet a man and fall pregnant by him. He was a married British soldier stationed in Northern Ireland, who would go on to abandon her and their daughter Charlene after he was transferred to a different station. Anne would then meet another man, and it was with him she had twins. This relationship did not last either, and so the twins were put up for adoption. In 1972, Anne would meet the love of her life, William Young. He was married but separated and waiting on his divorce to be finalised. They would end up moving in together in a house situated in the Sandy Row area of Belfast. William was a high-ranking member of the UDA and came from the loyalist Donegal Pass area and was a local UDA commander. But all would not go smoothly in this new romance. In 1973, William was interned at the Maze prison, and Anne was pregnant once more with William's baby. Anne often visited William in prison, and he would complain that he never got food parcels from his estranged wife, Elizabeth Young. You see, it was common practice that the LPA, which is the Loyalist Prisoners Association, would collect donations to provide parcels for the members imprisoned to make life more bearable, and this was done through the wives. But according to Anne, Elizabeth was not passing on the parcels, which she would later deny. The UDA claimed they did not know Elizabeth and William were separated, and so Anne had to provide the parcels to William herself, with no help from the LPA. This put a terrible strain on Anne financially, and so by 1974 she found herself living at the YWCA hostel on Malone Road in Belfast with Charlene while also pregnant. Anne by now was hanging around with the women's branch of the UDA. Not actually being a member put a target on her back. Not only was she good looking and popular with the men, she frequented the pubs on her own, which was a big no-no in the eyes of the UDA women, and she had also taken up with the ex-husband of one of their members, Elizabeth Young. You see, the women were staunch Protestants and very old-fashioned in their thinking when it came to morals, and Anne was seen as a woman with very loose morals, if any. The commander of the women's Sandy Row UDA group was a woman called Elizabeth Douglas, also known as Lily, which the name I will use so as not to confuse her with Elizabeth Young. Lily was a 40-year-old woman who had married at the age of 17. She lived in a terraced house on Sandy Row City Street and had 4 grown-up children by 1974. Lily was considered to be a plain, overweight, middle-aged woman. Not my words. She never had much growing up as she was from a poor working-class family. All she had seen in her 40 years was a life of drudgery within her marriage and motherhood. She was no angel though. She had a police record that would rival that of any criminal, male or female. She'd been in front of the judges and magistrates for a list of offences that included forgery, smuggling, assault and actual bodily harm. And finally, she also got done for running a brothel with her husband. She was a very powerful woman that had control over the women who served under her. As I said, Anne was struggling, and this is where she made the unfortunate mistake of airing her grievances in one of the pubs one evening, telling all that would listen that Elizabeth Young was not sending William parcels in prison, and instead she had the burden of doing so. Being overheard by the women's branch, word soon got back to Lily, who in turn approached Elizabeth Young. Elizabeth denied this was the case and was able to prove that she had been sending parcels to the prison. Anne's comments were regarded by the Women's UDA as an insult to their integrity, as the unit was responsible for the assembly and distribution of the parcels. Not only that, they did not approve of Anne's lifestyle. They saw her as loud, outspoken, had a maverick personality, and described by one local, had a habit of flaunting herself. Basically, Anne brought shame on the conservative community, and she was also a blow-in which didn't help her cause. On the 23rd of July 1974, Anne was abducted from Suffolk housing estate and brought to an old disused bakery on Hunter Street in Sandy Row, which had been converted into a UDA club. Here she was brought before a kangaroo court and questioned by the women, asking if she had made disparaging comments about Elizabeth Young, which Anne admitted that she had. Lily tore strips off her, threatening her with dire consequences and ostracisation if she did anything like that again. Lily said, "We have rules here, we stick to them, and I expect anybody new to do the same." Anne said nothing, but seemed to be shocked into silence by the seriousness with which Lily regarded the situation. A total of 8 women and 2 men presided over the court. This group of women, excluding Elizabeth Young, were known as the Heavy Squad, and they were the ones who dished out the punishment beatings under the orders of Lily. Anne was told that if she was found guilty, she would receive a rompering, as it was called, which was a severe beating and torture before being killed. There were many romper rooms across the north, and they would usually be found in abandoned warehouses, vacant buildings, lock-up garages, and rooms above pubs and drinking clubs. Once inside, a victim would be beaten and tortured before being killed. Although most of the victims were Catholics, many Protestants were also consigned to the romper rooms. The notorious UDA romper rooms had been invented in the early 1970s by UDA North Belfast Brigadier Davy Payne, named after the children's television programme. A kangaroo court is where the recognised standards of law and justice carries little or no official standing in the territory within which it resides. It may ignore due process and come to a predetermined conclusion. So Anne really was in trouble, but her fate would be delayed as the 2 men present at the trial could not reach a verdict, even though all the women present had found her guilty. As a result, the women were ordered to release Anne. The 8 women still present, plus Anne, piled into a car, and she was driven to Glengall Street to get the bus back to the hostel on Malone Road. When they got there, 2 of the women escorted Anne onto the bus, but as they did so, Anne made a comment referring to Lily. Who does she think she is, the Queen? Being that Lily's name was Elizabeth, and of course the Queen reigning at that time being Elizabeth. Returning to the car, the 2 women relayed what Anne had said. Incensed, Lily ordered that Anne be taken off the bus. 1 woman stood in front of the bus to stop it moving on, while 3 others went on to the bus, pulled Anne from her seat and bundled her out of the bus and into the car once again, and they all drove away. Again Anne would be saved, but she was seriously running out of luck. A phone call was made by the bus driver to the police station. He had taken down the registration number of the car and an alert was put out. The car was stopped by the RUC, which is the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and they were surprised to find 9 women in one car. The women told the officer that they were on their way to a party and that the incident on the bus was just them fooling around, which Anne agreed to, hoping it would find her in favour with Lily. The police, however, remained unconvinced, and they were all brought to the RUC station on Queen Street for questioning. Fearing the grisly fate of informers, Anne kept her mouth shut. Therefore, all the women were released without being charged at 2 a.m. the following morning. The police invited Anne to return to the station the following day to make a statement, but she refused. At 1 p.m. on the 24th of July, the group of UDA women met at a pub in Sandy Row to discuss what had happened and where they were to go regarding Anne. No one knew if the police had quizzed Anne and if she had told them what had happened and whether she had let slip anything about the organisation. Lily said something would need to be done. Within the hour, she put things into motion. That evening, a man named Albert Bumper Graham would kidnap Anne and her 6-year-old daughter Charlene from outside the social services in Shaftesbury Square. They knew Anne had an appointment there, and under the pretext that a commander of the UDA wanted to speak with her, Anne got into the blue minivan voluntarily. Albert drove them to the UDA club in Hunter Street, where a room on the first floor had been turned into a romper room. When the UDA women arrived, Anne immediately tried to escape with her daughter, but she failed. She was brought upstairs while Charlene was sent to the shop to buy sweets. And so it began. Anne was forced to sit on a wooden bench. By now she was blindfolded and hooded, her hands left untied, although some would say they were tied. Lily remained downstairs along with Albert and two teenagers, Henrietta Piper Cowan, 17, and Christine Smith, 16, were instructed to serve the punishment. They punched poor Anne forcefully into the face, knocking her to the floor. She was then kicked in the face, head and stomach by both girls, before picking up sticks and raining down more blows on Anne. Suddenly they stopped at the sound of poor little Charlene, who had come back from the shop and had heard her mother's cries. She mounted the stairs quickly and stood outside the door of the room where her mother was, screaming and crying for her mother to be let go. To the teenagers, it was time for a break, not out of sympathy for Charlene, but because they needed a break anyway, to have a rest and a cigarette, and cigarettes, while discussing what disco they were going to later on that night. By now Anne was in a bad way and was screaming for mercy and to be let go to attend her little 6-year-old daughter, but no mercy was shown. Instead, Albert came up the stairs and bundled Charlene down into the van. Lily had instructed him to drop Charlene back to the hostel, and so he did, dropping her off on the street, leaving her standing there alone in tears. Meanwhile, the beatings began again on Anne, this time the two girls using bricks to smash her head in. After an hour, Albert and a woman entered the room, and Albert knew by the blood on the hood that was over Anne's head things had gone too far. Taking the hood from Anne, they could see clearly she was dead. Albert gathered Anne's body up into another sack and brought her downstairs to Lily. She evinced no surprise on learning of the murder, but instead ordered the body to be brought away somewhere and dumped. As for the two girls that killed Anne, they went for a drink with Lily and the other women, later attending a disco that night, not a bother on them. Anne's body was found by workmen 5 days later in a ditch in Stockman's Lane near the M1 motorway, which leads to Dublin. The RUC were immediately called to the scene, which was photographed and mapped. Anne, wearing a red jumper, grey trousers and just one shoe, was lying on her back, partly submerged in 18 inches of water. Her missing shoe and large brown sack were discovered nearby. There was no identification on the body, and so the RUC put out a description in the hope someone would recognise her. The social worker Anne was to meet the day she and Charlene were kidnapped contacted the police and identified Anne through the rings she was wearing. When the family were contacted, Anne's brother would formally identify her. By now, suspects had been rounded up and taken in for interrogation, including the 8 women who had been in the car with Anne on the 23rd of July, plus 2 other women, basically the entire heavy squad. On the 6th of February 1975, the 2 teenage girls pleaded guilty to murder. They showed no remorse or guilt for what they had done. They were detained at Armagh's Women's Prison for life at the pleasure of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Lily Douglas pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the charge of murder was dropped because they were able to persuade the court that while she ordered the romping, she did not intend for Anne to be killed. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She also received 6 years for intimidation and detaining Anne against her will, which were to run concurrently with her 10-year sentence. She also made it quite clear in court that this killing had no connection to the UDA and that the Women's Heavy Squad acted alone, that it was not political, that it was a personal matter. I think our Lily was afraid of getting her own romping or a bullet in the head. Lily Douglas was lambasted by the trial judge. He said to her, "You ordered and directed the punishment of this girl. You chose and you chose well those who were to carry out your directions. When you heard what had happened, you organised the cover-up and disposal of the body. Your concern was that these happenings should not come to light. You were the commander of these women. Your responsibility was great. You are no stranger to crime. You have a record of smuggling, forgery, assault and actual bodily harm, and aiding and abetting the keeping of a brothel. Though the last of these was in 1961, it is an indication of your character." The Northern Irish press would dub her as the Sandy Row executioner. The others involved in the murder, including Albert, were given various sentences of 18 months to 2 years. The trial judge also denounced the UDA, saying, "I do not know what constitutes a paramilitary organisation. What appears before me today under the name of the UDA is gun law, a vicious, brutalising organisation of persons who take the law into their own hands and who, by kangaroo courts and the infliction of physical brutality, terrorise a neighbourhood through intimidation and rule an area of the city." Anne was buried in Templepatrick in County Antrim. Charlene and baby Derek were put into care. Anne's family received only £149 compensation from the state to cover Anne's funeral expenses. It was later revealed that Anne had intended to move to Scotland once the baby was out of hospital. Charlene would go on to get married and have 3 children. For a while, she was in touch with her brother Gary, one of the twins, but they eventually lost contact. She has no idea as to what happened to the other twin Stephen and baby Derek, which is so sad. Lily Douglas died in 1979, shortly after being released on compassionate grounds. The 2 girls were released in 1983, after serving just 9 years. They returned to the Sandy Row area, as did the rest that were released after serving their sentence. Loyalist sources claimed that Christine Smith, one of the girls that killed Anne, deeply regretted the part she played. Albert, after being released from prison, returned to South Belfast and refuses to discuss the murder to this day. William Young, Anne's lover, died in 2007. The disused bakery where Anne was murdered has since been demolished. As for the aftermath of Anne's murder and how people felt about it, Anne's murder caused widespread revulsion and shock throughout Northern Ireland, even though it had taken place during the most turbulent period of the Troubles, when bombings and sectarian killings had become commonplace. Protestants were especially appalled that Anne herself, a Protestant, was killed by a loyalist group, and they angrily denounced the UDA. Many journalists wrote of the sheer savagery and the fact that it was carried out by women, within earshot of Anne's daughter. A spokesman for the UDA released a statement in 1975 condemning the killing and the women's unit that carried it out. "We have completely disowned the Sandy Row Women's UDA. We think the whole affair was foul and sickening. Anne had been cleared by the UDA of an allegation about her private life long before she was killed. The killing was an act of jealousy by a group of women. The Sandy Row Women's Unit was permanently disbanded. None of the other UDA women's units had consented to or been aware of the fatal punishment beating until it was reported in the news." Anne was just 32 years old when she died. She did not have an easy life and she made some mistakes. This did not make her any less of a person, and she did not deserve to die in this horrific way. I hope her children that are all grown up now are somewhat happy, wherever they may be. They too were dealt a hard start in life, but most of all my heart goes out to Charlene, because she is the one who heard her mother's cries, and I'm sure it is something that has never left her. Rest in peace, Anne.